Hello, my name is Nuno Sacramento. I'm director of Peacock Visual Arts. I'm here to introduce today's fantastic talk. This talk takes place in the context of an exhibition called Another World is Possible. And it's an exhibition that centers itself in the work of Aberdeen People's Press. Uh, Most of you will know Aberdeen People's Press. Some of you were directly involved with it. But Aberdeen People's Press operated between 1973 and 1984, publishing a fortnightly alternative newspaper, pamphlets, and books, as well as providing a printing service for a wide range of radical groups, community newspapers, trade unions, and campaigning organizations. In addition to its printing and publishing activities, Aberdeen People's Press also acted as a hub, a meeting place for many of Aberdeen's activist groups, a node in a wide network of people and communities across the city, across Scotland, and more widely, the UK. As I said, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Margaret Lochry, who will be talking about action must be creation, not a reaction. Margaret has a brilliant CV involved in for a long time in radical activities. Formerly, Margaret Marshall was founder member of the Aberdeen People's Press, finding and learning to operate the printing press, writing and commissioning articles and pamphlets, and selling the fortnightly newspaper in pubs and other venues. I hear that I read somewhere that newspaper was selling at some point about 1,400 issues, which is a fantastic endeavor. She was an active member of Aberdeen Women's Liberation in the early 70s and helped to develop the first women's studies course for the Workers' Educational Association. She later became district secretary of the WEA North of Scotland, providing training for shop stewards, return to study courses for women, adult literacy, and community education. In the mid 1980s, she moved to London, where she was for many years chief executive of the Preschool Learning Alliance. In 2001, she received an honorary degree from the Open University for her work tackling educational disadvantage. In 2004, with a small group of others, she established a new organization called Capacity, which published research and evaluations and undertook training focusing on poverty, rural disadvantage, the work of children's centers, and family education. Welcome, Margaret. Margaret will be talking for a few minutes and maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion. The idea that I discussed with Margaret was that we would invite people to first raise their hands to ask a question, and then be given the opportunity to actually be seen when asking the question, rather than just writing it onto the little talk tool on the side. But it's really up to you. Raise your question, send us some questions about Margaret's talk, and let's have a brilliant conversation. The floor is all yours, Margaret.
Thank you, Nuno, and thank you for that introduction. I hope I can live up to it. It's a new experience for me giving a talk when I can't actually see anyone other than Nuno, but when we get to discussion, then I think we can all see each other. I've definitely got to start by saying thank you to Nuno and his team, to Andrew McGregor, to Alan Marshall and Denise, who really were a starting point and inspiration for this exhibition. The rest of us, APP members, have had a fantastic time, I think, meeting together to help curate the exhibition and to think back with a perspective of really almost a lifetime on what it all meant. The very first thing beyond that I'd like to say is that the 1970s was a bit like living life on the fast forward button. You know, in 10 years, we had 4 general elections, 4 prime ministers, 5 states of emergency, 2 property booms, and 2 oil crises. We went from low unemployment in the early 1970s to when we got early into the 80s, you know, unemployment had reached over 3 million. So the time when the APP began was, I think, a kinder time in history than the years that came later. There was still a consensus about the importance of the welfare state, about the importance of trade unions, regulating business, very much the dominant kind of political orthodoxy since the Second World War. Despite that, at the same time, 27% of Scots were described as living in the breadline. And although Aberdeen wasn't as exposed to this as other cities, it nevertheless contained people who were unemployed, who were living in poverty, and was home to, you know, some of the most deprived communities in Scotland. It was, of course, the start of the oil boom, and we began our work just as the oil boom was getting going, which provided a major boost to the economy, I think now in decline. But in the time that we're talking about, there were very few evident benefits for ordinary people in Aberdeen. It drove house prices through the roof and affected other local industries through loss of workers. So the idea of the newspaper came about very much certainly not from me. It came from somebody called Neville Fay, who ran the Aberdeen Arts and Community Workshop, who sort of persuaded us into the idea that this would be a good time to launch a community newspaper. And when you look back on things, they sometimes seem more systematic than they actually were. It wasn't systematic. We had the idea. It was a very open idea, and we just kind of got it going. But I think one thing that's worth saying, it was never just about journalism which exposes problems or corruption. I think some of the work we did could stand up to, you know, high standards of investigative journalism, but the paper was about more than that. It was about community and giving people a chance to have a newspaper they felt that was their own. And it was about opening up interest in alternative art, theatre, and a whole bunch of other things. It was all these things, but in our application to the Book of Visions, vision is not a word we use too much these days. This was an application for funding, and I'm going to try now to share my screen. We summed it up. Oops, nope. I'm trying to find my file, which was there. Here we go. This is what we wrote, that we wanted to show people that their difficulties are explicable in terms of a problem society rather than problem people, and that it is possible for us to act together to transform society. So that's what we set out to do. And it was a pretty broad canvas. None of us had ever done anything like this before. There wasn't a book you could get out of the library. We tried to learn as much as we could from other similar free presses elsewhere in the country, in particular from Westside and Manchester. But we pretty much, as they say, made it up as we went along. I hope others will forgive me for saying that. I think one of its strengths was that it was so open to contributions from other people. It was of the left, but didn't adopt a particular leftist line. It was flexible in what we were prepared to include in the paper. It was free, basically. And reading through the 50 plus editions of the Aberdeen People's Press, it's a pretty eclectic mix of articles, welfare rights advice, news, entertainment listings, jokes, cartoons, poems, pictures, the whole lot. Sometimes that mix and the way it was laid out on a page was a little bit baffling, but it had its own, I think, creative force. My take on it is that out of all these things, there were three important things we were trying to do. And there they are: call out inequality and injustice, provide voice, champion an alternative vision and values. Those, to me, were the three things that I think we were trying to do. If we talk a bit about the first, there was no shortage of material. A lot of the issues that arose directly or indirectly from the emerging oil boom, relating to land development, people losing their houses because of demolition to make way for roads or new city infrastructure, slum landlords, caravan parks that were described as coldits, homelessness. Lots of these issues were directly related to the oil industry, worker safety, another one, but some of them were just the nuts and bolts of the disconnect between people living in the city and the surrounding housing estates and the people who run the city. That disconnect between these two forces in terms of understanding what was actually going on in people's lives. A lot of the stories that we carried, we came back to again and again. We didn't just run something and then move on. We came back, and sometimes that meant that the same story would appear again and again, and maybe made the paper less readable, but it was part of the commitment, I think, that we were making. Providing voice. Having voice, I think, is crucial. It's not the only thing we need for human rights, but it's pretty fundamental to them. But lots of people aren't heard or are unable to speak or are afraid to speak. And that silence means that they're not free, and it separates them from help. And I think it separates them from solidarity. And we see a lot of that today. When it's left to people like the footballer Marcus Rashford to speak out on behalf of the 1 million plus people who live in this country who are destitute. But because we've so weaponized the whole issue of benefits, who are unable to speak out. Other people are afraid to speak out because they fear reprisals or threats. And that was true in the 1970s as it is today. I think one of the great things we did was to enable people's voices to be heard. Whether that was people who were being evicted from their homes. The very first issue of the paper carried a story about Mrs. Simpson, whose house was scheduled for demolition to make way for development, and who'd spent most of her adult life in that house. And the accommodation she'd been offered by the council was a house with broken windows in a rough area. Her voice wouldn't have been heard, I think, without us. Tenants associations in the estates around Aberdeen had their voices heard too when they formed their own action groups. And a lot of the material we carried what those associations had to say about inferior housing, about unsafe play areas, about the lack of facilities. And so I think we gave them voice too. Workers, prawn peelers from Tullis, who were having pay cuts. These and other stories like them would probably never have appeared in print if it hadn't been, I think, for the existence of the Aberdeen People's Press. And perhaps maybe one of the most telling issues is that over quite a long period in the life of the paper, we allowed battered women a voice, including an article by a woman who we call Mrs. A, who described, among other things, how her husband flung her down the stairs and showed us the marks on the doors where he repeatedly tried to beat the door down. Her story would never have appeared in the Press and Journal or any other media. And I think that was an important thing to do. Words bring us together. And one of the things I've noticed all through my life in the various things that I've done and the jobs I've had is that once people have a chance to tell their stories, to speak of what they know, then it's an incredibly energizing thing, and a spur to them to take the theme that Nuno has given me for this talk, to go and to create something new. And sometimes when people speak, whether that's workers who are being intimidated, battered women, other groups, when people speak, it enables change to take place. And as their stories emerge, then what has once been a given norm can finally change, and what was acceptable becomes unacceptable. So that was the second thing. And the third thing, I think, which is about alternative visions, is about breaking with the past, of making a fresh start on things, of people working together, like the people living in Tillydrone and Northfield who formed their own tenants associations, the mothers who created their own play facilities that were otherwise completely lacking, who lobbied the council about the fact that the award-winning open design of the estates meant that the children were in danger of falling into the river or being killed on busy main roads. Another development was the National Union of School Students, which was formed in, I think, 1972, and there was a local branch, and we carried many pieces about their activities, including a picket against army recruitment in schools and a manifesto for more democratic education, not just in Aberdeen, but for schools generally. And it's hard to conceive, really, that could happen, I think, now, of young people taking action of that kind. Another very creative organisation was the Aberdeen Claimants Union, which existed when we came to Aberdeen. And again, it's hard to imagine transplanting that idea of a claimants union to the present day, and yet it was incredibly valuable by its very existing. It was saying that people who are out of work and claiming benefits are still people, deserve respect, have views, and above all, should have rights. These are just some of the examples. A lot of my involvement was, as Nuno said, as well as the paper, with women's liberation. And here there was a great proliferation of projects. Women's studies courses, which were put together simply by women coming together and pooling their knowledge. running classes and discussion groups, writing articles and pamphlets, and as Nuno said, sometimes demonstrating or taking other kind of action. And it was a very exciting, I think, and thrilling time. And it was Aberdeen Women's Liberation, which started the first women's aid group. And the legacy of that's still around today with Grampian Women's Aid. And there were lots of other things. Not all of them particularly centred in Aberdeen, but some of them were. Free schools, I don't think reached Aberdeen, but we certainly carried lots of material in the paper on democratic alternatives to schooling. Radical social workers were certainly active in Aberdeen. There was even a radical scientist group. And of course, the radical psychiatry movement itself stemmed from the 1960s rather than the 70s. So looking back on all that, it felt like there was a kind of wave of energy. And in a city like Aberdeen, which is fairly compact and which people know each other and people were part of more than one organisation or group, it felt like we'd established a kind of commons in which, you know, anything that needed to be done could be done. And of course, it wasn't all plain sailing, and sometimes we didn't agree, but there was, I think, a feeling of solidarity among people that I don't recall, you know, at other times, certainly in my adult life. And just to try and wind up a bit, I think what characterised it, certainly, this is my take on it, is that for maybe the first time in that period, we shared knowledge that was not simply scientific, official, political knowledge, but people's lived experience, experiential knowledge, what it meant to live in a damp house, what it meant to be silenced by a slap in the face or worse, what it meant to be humiliated in school where that happened, or to be belted, what it meant to be out of work, what it meant to be victimized at work, that knowledge was as important, if not more important, than abstract knowledge. But certainly we moved on the basis of a combination of these things. Secondly, you know, the groups, and Neil and Nuno have produced, I think, and it's visible in the studio, maybe Nuno could share it with us later, a sort of map of all the different organisations that were active in Aberdeen at that time, a sort of network, a hive of different interests and overlapping interests. But lots of these groups weren't, you know, constituted in any formal kind of way. They were experimental. They had a very loose organisation, or maybe no organisation at all, primarily collectives or perhaps co-ops. And of course, APP became a cooperative in a formal sense. And trying to work in a way that reflected the values that we were trying to explore and promote, of non-hierarchical forms of organisation, of everybody having a stake, of people not being the property of others or being put down by others that they work to live with. And that has come across the decades as the slogan, "the personal is political." But I think that's what we believed at the time. we have to internalize what we believe and not just be against what other people are doing, but reflective of how our relationships with other people. And finally, as I mentioned, there was a solidarity. And I think Aberdeen was a really, ideal place for this to happen, because it wasn't a huge city. People knew each other, they lived close to each other. And there was a sense that we were creating energy and that things could change. And although, we were not to know just what the impact of the new right, Thatcherism, the new political orthodoxy would be, and just how damaging it was to so many projects, I think you can, maybe just my optimistic view, I think you can still see the legacy of the things that we did in things that are going on in Aberdeen today and elsewhere. And, maybe that's something we could pick up in the discussion. Anyway, that's enough from me. Nuno.
Thanks very much, Margaret, for a brilliant, a very inspiring chat. Before I just open to the room, I would like to ask you a question myself, just picking up on something that you said. I mean, Aberdeen, it's still a small city, and it's still can be described in many ways, as you just described it, being in the 70s. We might be towards the end of a cycle, of an oil cycle that started when you guys were in town and when you guys set up Aberdeen People's Press. And there's certainly still a number of people within the city that still believe in this idea of a commons, that we can establish a commons, and that we can change things by being together in solidarity. The question is very much picking up on something that you said in the beginning. Vision is not a word that we use very much. I mean, I see that word being used widely in business plans. So they ask you, what's your vision and mission? But I don't really see it maybe being used at all, like in the Book of Visions from 73. So maybe you can expand a little bit on that, and then I'll open up to other questions.
Well, I think you're right, no, but in the intervening years, lots of words have been infused with different meanings. Yeah, they've been reified or sometimes weaponized, and vision as a term of business is, you said it yourself, is a long way from vision, in the sense that we used it then, and people, like-minded people, might use it today. I think the other point is that there are lots of really important groups meeting. There are movements like Extinction Rebellion. They're still very active. Women's organizations still with a lot of work to do in terms of the safety of women. But I think where the vision side comes in is when that can be integrated into something that's not just about a single vision, but is something more determined to try and bring about root and branch change.
Very good. Thanks very much for that. I would like now to open for questions. So we have about 20 attendees. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand.
Thank you, Margaret. That was fantastic. Sorry, I'm Andrew, archivist at the university. Okay, I was going to ask Margaret, thanks very much for that. I was really intrigued about what was the view of the People's Press members of the tradition, of the what I would call the traditional left. So that would be, and whether you you felt you were doing something different from them? Were you working with them, but was there also a degree of moving away from them to start your own group?
I think so. I think sometimes that relationship, depending on which bit of the left you might be thinking of, was slightly uneasy. As I said, we were of the left, and and we worked with and cooperated, not just in the newspaper, but through the printing service, with a whole range of groups. But we didn't have a particular line, and certainly I think there was a feeling that, the main organisation on the left, the Labour Party, was out of touch, or not engaging us. But there were lots of areas, the Aberdeen Trades Council, there were good relationships between, and the other members of the APP who could answer this better than me, who are in touch with union organisers and with people in the offshore industry. But I'd say it was a loose relationship. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, that's great. That's what I was thinking about, working together, obviously, but maybe a sense of doing something slightly different. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm so sure that they always approved of us. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. Charlie is about to join us to ask a question as well.
Okay, right. I mean, I agree with what you said, Margaret, about solidarity and empowerment, and certainly that was noticeable when I first came to Aberdeen in '72, about how groups spoke to one another, etc. I mean, one of the interesting things is that a lot of the solidarity, like for example, you talk about the claimants union, for example, welfare rights and things like that. You went and saw an individual face to face, and they accompanied you, for example, to the benefits office, and they represented you. So people felt empowered in that way.
Yeah.
Currently, in my more recent involvement, people tend to phone these people up, and as a consequence, you're practically reliant on other folk to advance your cause. And yeah. I think really part of the problem, as I see it, is, I mean, we know about squatting, Marcus, both of us are involved in a squat, and homeless people were doing things like that. They were taking direct action, and that wasn't a very empowering thing. But for example, once you get the proliferation of huge sort of national advocacy agencies, they take that power away from people in some ways. And in some ways, for example, if you look at the position of people who are homeless, there's a lot of homeless people around, but they're totally disempowered in the sense they don't really have, if they can't get connection with these agencies through the phone or the internet, they're still basically empowered. And that's the big difference I see with what was happening then and what's happening now. In saying that, though, of course, the condition of homeless people, or the rights of homeless people, are a lot better now than they were then. That's not really a question, I suppose. I'm sorry about that.
I think that's a really important, important point that you made, and a really interesting point, Charlie. And because time is limited, I could have included, the voice that the Squatters movement gave to people who were homeless or otherwise insecure in terms of housing. But what I think now is that the organizations which are there to, quote, help people, there is a divide there. They're no longer the champions of people, yeah? As you've just said, the claimants union championed people when they were up against officialdom. And some of the things which started off led by, or because the need was seen by, the people who were most affected by them have become kind of service agencies, and they operate to protocols which are around service contracts, rules that stem from funding, and it's a different kind of relationship, I think. And sometimes it can feel to people who are supposed to be helped, kind of still a them and us relationship.
Very good. Thanks, Margaret. Andrew Rigby would like to ask a question as well.
Right, I thought that was great, Margaret, really. And I see I've got 2 hours in Rigby. When you were talking about providing a voice I just wondered if you've got any thoughts now, because it was a particular period, you know, with the printed word, and you know that I'll just you know, open it up for you to comment about other. Is there this, you know, where do people find a voice now? I mean, there's a whole, you know, new technology. Well, it's not new now, but new to me. Anyway, it was that what that providing a voice nowadays. Would there be a space? What would be the equivalent of Aberdeen People's Press?
That's a really good question, Andy, and I think it's one that cropped up when when we were meeting in advance of the exhibition. You know, it's in theory, social media could provide that. The internet was conceived of as a commons, wasn't it, in the first place, but it's such a long way from that. Yeah. If I'm honest, I don't really know what the answer to that is. I mean, people do still find ways of being heard. You know, an example would be the families of people certainly in England who died of COVID, and their memorial of hearts in Westminster was an amazing piece of communication on behalf of that particular group. But I think that, you know, the extent to which you can find ways to have your voice heard doesn't just depend on the medium, although you're absolutely right to raise that question, but how remote you feel, how othered you feel. And some of the people who are suffering most in society today are the victims of othering, because they, you know, because of the, you know, kind of still prevalence of things like, you know, benefit scroungers, single parents, the notion that, you know, they don't work because they don't want to work, they've all got plasma TVs. If you live with that day in, day out, and you're labelled by that, I think it's very hard to raise your voice. Or migrants at the moment as well in England.
Yeah, thanks.
Maybe Alan could answer your question, and and he does say it, where the voices should be heard.
Very good. Thanks for that, Andrew. Alan's got the floor.
But he's here, good. Because I can't see who's here till he speaks.
Oh yes, I can. I can promote Alan to panelist, and we can also see him.
I felt my hand being raised there. Somehow, listening to Margaret, there's so much to be said in the subject, but on a particular subject of, I suppose it goes under the general heading of social media these days. At any rate, commentators tend to lump everything into social media. And I think it's very important to make a distinction between social media of the type Facebook, Twitter, and whatever else, and alternative media on internet. And long time ago, 30 or 40 years ago, a cultural historian, Raymond Williams, developed a notion of mobile privatization as being one of an important trend in society, in which people and the imagined communities that we have around us, that we belong to, through different activities, through different types of reading, through different kinds of what we watch on television, the things that we think, in a sense, together, even if we never meet. These imagined communities were being fragmented and individualized. And that was 30 odd years ago, at least. Social media of the Facebook variety have done exactly that and taken it to an extreme. I think it's very important to bear in mind that there are alternative media, and I think that's where there's a link with, there's a descendancy, progression from what Aberdeen People's Press was trying to do, which was a collective effort, and alternative media, which may or may not be tightly organised, or organised at all, apart from in technical terms, but where there's a collective, a collegial approach, an editorial approach, an attempt to take a perspective on questions, to have a perspective on society, on economics and science, or whatever the subject happens to be, but to have a critical distance on what's going on, and to have a collective critical distance, which gives some kind of, I mean, it's the age-old question of what is the editorial function? The editorial function is to know who you're speaking to, who you're reading, whether it be on a screen, whether it be on paper. You want to know where it's coming from. You want to know what the underlying premises are of the people who are speaking to you. In the social media, it can go off in all directions simultaneously. Alternative media are much more reasoned in their approach, and try to make sense of what's going on. Whereas the kind of straight, pure social media is not at all that. And I think there are examples of alternative media today in which you can see that there's a similar approach to the kind of approach. I mean, Aberdeen People's Press wasn't the only organisation to attempt that. It was part of a national movement, an international movement even. But I think it's this collective part which is extremely important when analysing and discussing current digital media. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Very good, Alan. Thanks for that. You raised some very, very interesting points there that bring the conversation to today. I was wondering whether anyone else has got a question or a comment or would like to contribute to this, to this particular question. Ian Baird.
Hello. Yeah, just really, thanks, Margaret, for that talk. It's very stimulating. Just a comment on that last point that either you or Alan or both might respond to. This concept of editorial input and control is something that I've been really interested in. I think Alan's completely right. I think it's needed. But perhaps one of the problems that alternative press had, or alternative forums or media have, is that they seek to describe themselves as open to the people and just say what you want. And I think there is a tension there and a conflict. I get extremely frustrated online with unmoderated content, but I'm also aware that there is a perception that editorial input in whatever medium you're talking about is, exaggeration, but is considered as a kind of censorship, So would either of you like to expand on that or explain your viewpoints on that? I'd be very interested.
Well, I'm not sure I'm best placed to answer it, Ian, but again, it's a really important question. When I said, and I don't go back on it, I think we'd have, in the APP, we had a very open editorial policy. I think there was a security for us because we came from, a set of, reasonably shared values, opinions, and so on. And the people who wanted to appear in the paper, I can't remember, maybe it did happen at any occasion when someone wanted to contribute something that would, seriously offend us or our readers. I don't recall anyone wanting to put, say, a National Front point of view. So maybe in a way we just skirted the point you've made, which is about, you know, should you, can you editorialize? But what I do think is if you're trying to support, engage, be friends with people who are largely hemmed in by, you know, institutions, organizations, by other people, then the less editorializing you do, the better, I think.
I suppose there's maybe a equivalent here with thinking about no platforming and cancel culture and all that, all these kind of issues that are raised with different vocabulary nowadays.
Yeah, yes. Really, you could have a whole seminar, webinar on that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Who would get excluded though? Yeah.
Andrew Rigby wants to come in. Could you please switch on the microphone, Andrew, and ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me? No, it was about this point you raised, Ian. I mean, I have a distinct memory of us having a discussion in the print room in Ruby's Law Den. There was a publication that came, what was it, Tyranny of Powerlessness or something. It was published. It was written by a feminist.
It was the tyranny of structurelessness.
That's it. I can't say the S word, structurelessness. I remember us discussing that because we didn't have formal decision-making processes, but there were parameters that we were operating with, a number of, you know, a core group shared. And I don't know if we ever, you know, anyway, it was just, there was editorial control, you know, there was editorial, even though we didn't have an editor per se.
Yeah.
In line with that tyranny of structuralist argument. Well, I mean, one could identify with it.
Yeah.
Very good. I can see David Francis is wanting to ask a question as well or make a comment.
Yeah, I was interested in when you were talking about the three main purposes of the paper. One of them was championing an alternative vision, and it's interesting that is expressed as a singular. And I just wondered if, in the presence of many alternative visions, if what you thought were the unifying elements of that vision, and if you think that those unifying elements are now hopelessly dispersed in this time, you know, the rise of identity politics.
Well, of course, you're right, Dave. There were visions, but I think they were sufficiently overlapping to maybe allow us to say vision, yeah. And I, you know, some of these overlapping areas were things like I suppose the idea of finding something that was broad-based and good for people. I mean, that's a very crude way of finding it, well, of putting it, whether that the special interest was women or something else, or whether it was about, you know, a different relationship with the environment, and people gave practical expression to that through projects like Garthdee Farm and others, and you know, lots of other projects that had their own particular focus. But I think there was some kind of, not all unifying, but there were sufficient links sort of around rejecting, you know, established power structures, calling out power. Charlie said this in one of our meetings, and I think whether that's the power to degrade the environment or cause animal suffering or caused people suffering. You know, it wasn't clear and systematic. It was loose, but you know, it felt like there was something in all of this that amounted to, you know, a rounder vision as opposed to one issue. Or maybe that's just my recollection.
Thanks for that, David. I think it's very, very important to continue reminding ourselves that with editorial or non-editorial, there were certain visions that were very often followed by a kind of a materialization of those visions, a collective materialization of those visions. And I think that's something that's really important. And somehow many of us in current times feel a bit more crippled in terms of getting together in solidarity and actually trying to materialize those alternative visions to the way society is structured out. We're getting closer to 5 o'clock. We still have time maybe for a question or two if anyone in the room is interested in asking another question or making a comment.
Can I ask one quick one? Sorry, if no one else has got a new one, yeah. Margaret, I was intrigued. I don't want to end on a finish, if you know what I mean, but I was intrigued about the end of Aberdeen People's Press and how, I know that came with various members moving away and other members coming in and that, but so I'm intrigued about towards the end of or towards when you were involved in APP, whether you felt everything had been achieved, or did you feel that others could take it on? Or I know we were moving into, as you say, the second Thatcher government, really, weren't we, in '83? So I just wonder what you thought about at the end, whether the same issues were still prevalent, whether you still felt that optimism and whatever. Yeah.
Oh, maybe not the best person to ask, because I adopt a pretty, glass full rather half full rather than empty view of things. I think there were all kinds of reasons why individuals moved on, not least of which was it was a lot of it was really hard. You had no money, you lived for years with no money. Yeah. When Greer, who's here today, when she was born, we were living in a flat in Nelson Street that had an outside loo and no bathroom. You had to prepare, yeah, because we didn't have salaries. So that's one thing. People moved on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they moved on and the contribution they made was lost. They might have made that contribution somewhere else. I can think. I mean, I don't know if Sandy Scott's here today because I don't know everybody's here, but who went on to really doing important things in local government and bringing those values that he'd given to the press there. And there were other people who did the same. It's not so much APP, but I see that Chris already sees some of the work that Chris and I were involved in the WA was about women who regarded themselves or had been labelled as failures coming back to education. And once they started, the sky was the limit, and they went on to exercise power in different jobs, professions. But I do think kind of the rise of Thatcher and what happened subsequently brought a premature end that wouldn't necessarily otherwise have occurred. The Arts Council had been an important source of funding for radical theatre, for radical art projects. Other bodies who were providing funding found themselves in a different position, and even on kind of next to no wages, projects need money to survive. Yeah, so if there were, if there were a chance to do something like this again, then maybe starting with a survival strategy wouldn't be a bad idea. Rather than finding out that we didn't have one yet.
Thanks very much. I was wondering whether Charlie's hand is a new hand. If yes, would you like to ask a question or make a comment, Charlie?
I'll start again. I'm muted. At the last Extinction Rebellion meeting, just following on from what you said about young people in Aberdeen, the Marshall Square was full of young people, including school pupils. So there's something. So the ground is not entirely fallow. There's a lot of activity there, which is absolutely very, very encouraging, and that's been consistent throughout the demonstration in the city in terms of Extinction Rebellion in particular. But one of the things we're talking about the media, etc., alternative media, and there is a thing in Scotland called the Ferret. I don't know if anyone's come across it. And the Ferret is a cooperative. You subscribe to it, and it covers both the micro and the macro in terms of, so it'll cover local issues, but it'll also cover sort of national issues, and it also writes articles for the Guardian, etc. Now they've got, for example, like Rob Edwards involved in it, who actually sort of edited Scram, which is printed by Aberdeen People's Press away in those days. So it's quite interesting how these things are continued. But I suppose the question I wanted to ask, and it's to Andrew McGregor, does Andrew, from his knowledge of the Aberdeen People's Press and his involvement in the social centre, does he see any kind of links, any obvious links between what was happening then and what's happening now?
Didn't expect to be put on the spot. Thank you, Charlie.
Well, it's tough at the front.
I feel like saying tune in to the last talk, which is the fifth talk when we're talking about the past, present, and future of social movements in the city. But I suppose a short, quick answer. I hope so. I think there's a definite case of, personally, an amazement for me to go back and read what happened and reading the APPs, and everyone I've spoken to and showed them have been amazed at so many issues, especially in Ether, the environmental magazine. These guys were talking about issues that this generation thinks they've come up with, and I think that's particularly grounding, slightly shameful perhaps, but grounding for them to believe that they're part of a wider movement over time, and obviously the same issues still need to be fixed. So I think it's quite interesting that people of today they are receptive to hearing about what went on in the past. They like to be a part of something that's wider, and hopefully that means some connections between generations, because often generations particularly don't speak to each other, or they see themselves as parent and child. But if we can get a combination of the generations joining up, especially in environmentalism, that might actually make a serious movement there for some serious change. So I think, like Margaret said, I'm ever hopeful as well.
I think that's a good note to come to an end, we're ever hopeful, yeah.
It's a brilliant note. It's about coming to an end today, but this is, as I said, the first one of 5 talks that take place within the context of the exhibition Another World is Possible about Aberdeen People's Press. On the 10th of August, in just a few days, we will have David Francis talking about one does not compromise with a society in decay. And then a few days later, a couple of weeks later, we'll have Ian and Andy Rigby talking about diggers and dreamers, prefiguring the future. Then into early September, Aberdeen People's Press, community newspapers, and the end of printers' monopoly over print. Alan will be sharing some thoughts and ideas about the technological context. And finally, as Andrew was mentioning, the question for the last panel, is another Aberdeen possible? So I'd like to finish by thanking Margaret for her generosity, for a great and very, very inspiring talk, and also thanking everyone for being here on a Sunday afternoon. Beautiful weather, raining in Aberdeen, probably sunny elsewhere. Everyone that's attended, all the attendees, thank you very much. You'll be able to find links to the other talks in Peacock's website and social media. So thank you very much, everyone, and I hope to see you in a couple of weeks' time.
Thanks, Nuno, and thank you
Thanks,
for
Nuno.
making it possible. Yeah.